Now that everybody has some real meatier JavaScript under their belt, we need to revisit the DOM, or the Document Object Model. Now we talked about it briefly a while back during the HTML and CSS section of the course, but we never really addressed why it's significant, why we care, or how it relates to the code that we're writing, and that's because it is primarily relevant to JavaScript. By now you've had plenty of experience using the inspector in Chrome Developer Tools, and if you recall, when you were creating replicas from the source code of, say, the Google replica, we strictly told you not to copy your code from this Elements section. We instead told you to go to the Sources section, where you'd find a file tree very similar to how we tell you to set up your projects, and to copy the code from the index.html and main.css in there. And that's because the Sources panel shows you the exact documents you're working from, or that this page is powered by. This is the code, line by line, word for word, that was written to power the page we're currently visiting. The Elements tab, on the other hand, is a live representation of that code. That can seem like a subtle difference, but what's really happening is our code is being read and interpreted by the browser and the JavaScript engine in some cases in certain ways, and the resulting website is spat out. That resulting website and the code which is currently powering it in real time can differ from the code which you've written. They're usually minor differences. Sometimes you'll see some pseudo elements that you didn't actually write, but which the browser automatically creates. Don't worry too much about those. More importantly, the difference is that JavaScript can actually manipulate this live code environment. It can manipulate the DOM. And this is exactly what the Elements tab is showing us. It's showing us the DOM, the Document Object Model. And it's called that because our document, which is to say all of our HTML, which powers this website, as far as JavaScript is concerned, is one giant object. By now you've seen us write functions using things like document.getElementById. And we would have some ID in here. Well, by now you should realize that this is just classic dot notation. GetElementById is a function, note that it's followed by parentheses, and it is a function that is being enacted upon the document object. The document object. This dot notation should look pretty similar. I mean, this is how we access properties of larger objects. Zodiac I.sign, or Zodiac I.image, or students I.name. We've dealt with plenty of examples of accessing properties of larger objects using dot notation. The fact that getElementById is just a function doesn't really make a difference to us. But let's take it a step further. Document.getElementById usually gives us some HTML element to work with, right? An HTML element which has this ID attribute. And then we accessed a property of that element, like .innerText or .textContent. This is the exact same thing. This is, we're simply going one additional layer deep. The document is the root object, the big object that contains everything on our page. GetElementById is a function that we're executing on that object. And these two together return or evaluate to some HTML element, which is itself a smaller object within the document object. And that smaller HTML element object has a property called .innerText, which we are accessing the same way that we do Zodiac at some index.sign or students at some index.name. It's not something that you need to keep in the forefront of your mind as you code, because I don't want it to trip you up, I don't want it to confuse you, and I don't want you to get lost in very long or complex dot notation. But it is important that you understand, one, that the document which runs our websites is, to the JavaScript browser, a giant object. We can actually see it if I jump into my console. Now, if I type in document and hit enter, it's going to return this weird, useless HTML object, hashtag document. And if I open it up, look at that, it's my HTML document itself. It's the page. This is the markup that we would expect to see. And all of the code in here, all of the HTML in here is identical to the code that we would see in our Elements tab. So that's not very helpful for understanding what we're talking about here, right? So I'm going to show you how to actually see the document object. This is not something you need to know or do, but I want you to see it. So if I type this in, don't worry about what it is, but if I type this in and hit enter, it will show me the actual object that makes up our HTML document. This kind of looks like gibberish. I don't expect you to find meaning in there, but if we open it up, then we can see this is a document which has a URL property, an active element property, a link color property, all property, anchors property, applets property, base URI, BG color, body, character set, car set, child element count, child nodes, children, etc., etc., etc. Every one of these properties are properties of the HTML document object. Okay, so let's see if we can find a familiar one. Scroll up to how about document.body? We have definitely used that one before. Here we go. So here's the body property. And if I wanted to see exactly what's in the body property, I could expand it. But the code is not going to be terribly legible for us right now. This isn't helpful for us. But it is important that you understand, once again, that the HTML document is a giant object with a number of properties which we are simply accessing or executing some function upon whenever we write a line like document.getElementById. The reason that's important is not just to confuse you a little bit further, but to drive home the point that if the HTML document itself is one giant object containing 100% all of the content of our site, then that means every element in our HTML is also an object to the JavaScript browser. My document.body, which returns the body HTML element, an element we're all very familiar with, document.body is itself an object. Now the console shows it to me as HTML markup, same thing that's represented in the Elements tab in the document object model, but this is in fact an object. Don't let it fool you. And as an object, my document.body also has its own properties. Document.body. How about inner text? If I hit enter, it's going to return an empty string, and that's because clearly our body is totally empty. But I can do more than just access these properties. As we've seen, we inserted text into HTML elements in our Zodiac app. So if I wanted to insert text into my document body right here, I could access the inner text of my body object in my document object and set it equal to some text. And that will actually print that text inside the body element. Okay, so now that I've added text to my body by accessing the inner text property of my body object, of my document object, and setting it equal to the value of a string, I can jump into my Elements tab and actually see that text, that string, represented inside my body element. So far, so good. At the same time, I can jump back into sources, and I can look in my index.html, and inside my body element, no string. No string. So that is the difference. Okay? The source, the index.html document that is used as the source code for this website, does not show this text, which is now occupying the body element. The reason is because this text only exists in the live code. We haven't gone back and manipulated the source code. We've gone ahead and manipulated and added content to the DOM, the live code, the live version, live running version or running copy of the code which we originally wrote. That is JavaScript's power. It can manipulate the DOM. It can add content, remove content, dramatically manipulate HTML content, change styles. And .inner text is just one property of one HTML element that we can access and assign value to. I can give my body a class name. Let's throw in some Bootstrap classes. BG dark, text white, hit enter, and there we go. We have a dark background, dark gray background with white text. Rather than inner text, what if I change this to inner HTML and hit enter? Well, first, nothing changes, but as we know from experimenting with inner HTML, I can actually put full HTML markup in here. I can, rather than just insert some string, I can make some string an h1 with a Bootstrap class of display1. And the browser will correctly interpret that HTML markup. If I do the exact same thing using the inner text property, it's actually going to print that HTML markup in the body, which we obviously don't want. Okay, so these are just two properties for manipulating an HTML element object in a different way. You should never feel compelled to memorize any of these properties. There are too many. What you should feel compelled to do is try to recognize the patterns that you see. Try to ask yourself questions. If you need to access the alt property of an image element using JavaScript, could you figure out how to do that? Could you figure out how to do that? So, for example, if I didn't know that .className allows me to access the class names of an element and assign them a new value, I would probably guess something like .class. And I would try something like this. And it wouldn't work. It simply wouldn't work. It wouldn't do anything. It wouldn't do what I expected or what I wanted. So that would be my cue to jump into Google and say, run a search query like edit HTML class from JavaScript. And the very first link that pops up is a Stack Overflow. Second link is a Stack Overflow link. Third link is W3 Schools. That's always a good place to start, so I'm going to start there. And there it is, the HTML DOM class name property. And here's an example, document.getElementById, my div. This evaluates to and returns an HTML element, which is an object, which has apparently a class name property that I can set to my style. And this class, my style, probably has some meaning. It probably has some style attached to it. And there it is. Width 300 pixels, height 100 pixels, background color coral, font size 25 pixels, color white, margin bottom 10 pixels. So if I click this button, I should expect this div element to have the myStyle class name, and therefore all these styles. And there it goes. It works. Okay, so that is me trying to manipulate a class name of an element without knowing how to do so, and very quickly running a Google search query that leads me to the right direction.